Series L. 1809. The dangers surrounding Napoleon were immense. The Austrian army, 320,000 strong with her landwehr, 544,000 men, and 800 cannon, had never been so great, never so fitted for war. Prussia was already seething with secret societies, of which as yet the only formidable one was the Tugendbund, whose headquarters were Königsberg, and whose chief members were Stein, Stadion, Blücher, John. Perhaps their most sensible scheme was to form a united German empire, with the Archduke Charles as its head. The Archduke Ferdinand invaded the Duchy of Warsaw, and had he taken Thorn with its park of 100 cannon, Prussia was to join Austria. In Italy, the Carbonari and Adelphs only waited for the French troops to go north to meet the Austrians to spread revolt in Italy. Of the former, the head lodge was at Capua, and its constitutions written in English, since England was aiding this Chouannerie religieuse as a lever against Napoleon. England had an army of 40,000 men ready to embark in any direction to Holland, Belgium, Naples, or Biscay, while the French troops in Portugal were being tampered with to receive Marat as their leader, and to march with Spaniards and English for the Pyrenees. At Paris, Talleyrand was in partial disgrace, but he and Fouché were still plotting the latter, says Pellet, forwarding daily a copy of the private bulletin, prepared for Napoleon's eye alone, to the Bourbons. After Essling and the breaking of the Danube Bridge, he hesitated between seizing supreme power himself or offering it to Bernadotte. Up to the last to March 27th, the correspondence proves that Napoleon had hoped that war would be averted through the influence of Russia. All initiative, he declared, rested on the heads of the court of Austria. Menaced on all sides, warned of the intentions of his enemies by their movements and by their intercepted correspondence, seeing from that moment hostilities imminent, he wishes to prove to France and Europe that all the wrongs are on their side, and awaits in his capital the news of an aggression that nothing justifies, nothing warrants. Vain prudence. Europe will accuse him of having been the instigator on every occasion, even in this. On April 8th, the Austrians violated Bavarian territory, and during his supreme command for the next 5 days Berthier, endangered the safety of the French Empire in spite of the most elaborate and lucid instructions from Napoleon, which he failed to comprehend. Never, says Pellet, was so much written, never so little done. Each of his letters, Berthier's, attests the great difference which existed between his own correspondence and that which was dictated to him. An ideal chief of staff, he utterly lacked the decision necessary for a commander-in-chief. The arrival of Napoleon changed in a moment the position of affairs. The sudden apparition of the emperor produced the effect of the head of Medusa and paralyzed the enemy. Within 5 days, the Austrians were 4 times defeated, and Ratisbon, the Passepartout of southern Germany and halfway house between Strasbourg and Vienna, is once more in the hands of France and her allies. Pellet considers these operations as the finest which have been executed either in ancient or modern times, at any rate those of which the projects are authentically proved. He foretells that military men from every country of Europe, but specially young Frenchmen, will religiously visit the fields of the labor. They will visit with Napoleon's correspondence in their hands, much more precious than every other commentary, the hills of Pfaffenhofen, the bridge of Landshut, and that of Eckmühl, the mill of Stangl, and the woods of Roking. A few days later, the Archduke Charles writes a letter to Napoleon, which is a fair type of those charming yet stately manners which made him at that moment the most popular man in Europe. "Sire," he writes, "Your Majesty's arrival was announced to me by the thunder of artillery, without giving me time to compliment you thereon. Scarcely advised of your presence, I was made sensible of it by the losses which you have caused me. You have taken many of my men, sire. My troops also have made some thousands of prisoners in places where you did not direct the operations. I propose to your Majesty to exchange them man for man, grade for grade, and if that offer is agreeable to you, please let me know your intentions for the place destined for the exchange. I feel flattered, sire, in fighting against the greatest captain of the age. I should be more happy if destiny had chosen me to procure for my country the benefit of a lasting peace. Whichsoever they be, the events of war or the approach of peace, I beg your Majesty to believe that my desires always carry me to meet you, and that I hold myself equally honored in finding the sword, or the olive branch, in the hand of your Majesty. Number 1. Donauworth, And the same day Napoleon writes almost an identical letter to Cambaceres, adding, however, the news that the Tyrolese are in full revolt. On April 20th, he placed himself at the head of the Württembergers and Bavarians at Abendsburg. He made a stirring speech, number 15,099 of correspondence, and legend tells us that the Prince Royal of Bavaria translated into German one sentence after another as the emperor spoke, and officers repeated the translations throughout the ranks. On April 24th is issued from Ratisbon his proclamation to the army. Soldiers, you have justified my expectations. You have made up for your number by your bravery. You have gloriously marked the difference between the soldiers of Caesar and the armed cohorts of Xerxes. In a few days we have triumphed in the pitched battles of Thann, Abendsburg, and Eckmühl, and in the combats of Peising, Landshut, and Ratisbon. 100 cannon, 40 flags, 50,000 prisoners. Before a month we shall be at Vienna. It was within 3 weeks. He was specially proud of Eckmühl, and we are probably indebted to a remark of Pasquier for his chief, but never divulged reason. A noteworthy fact in connection with this battle was that the triumphant army was composed principally of Bavarians and Württembergers. Under his direction, these allies were as greatly to be feared as the French themselves. At St. Helena was written, "The Battle of Abendsburg, the maneuvers of Landshut, and the Battle of Eckmühl were the most brilliant and the most skillful maneuvers of Napoleon." Eckmühl ended with a fine exhibition of a white arm, merle by moonlight, in which the French proved the superiority of their double cuirasses over the breastplates of the Austrians. Pellet gives this useful abstract of the campaign of 5 days. April 19th Union of the French army whilst fighting the Archduke, whose base is already menaced. April 20th Napoleon, at Abendsburg and on the banks of the Laber, breaks the Austrian line, totally separating the center from the left, which he causes to be turned by Massena. April 21st, he destroys their left wing at Landshut, and captures the magazines, artillery, and train, as well as the communications of the enemy's Grand Army, fixing definitely his own line of operations, which he already directs on Vienna. April 22nd, he descends the Laber to Eckmühl, gives the last blow to the Archduke's army, of which the remnant takes refuge in Ratisbon. April 23rd, he takes that strong place, and forces the Archduke to take refuge in the mountains of Bohemia. Number 2. May 6th on May 1st Napoleon was still at Braunau, waiting for news from de Vaust. Traveling by night at his usual speed, he reached Lambach at noon on May 2nd, and Wells on the 3rd. The next morning he heard Massena's cannon at Ebersberg, but reaches the field at the fall of night too late to save the heavy cost of Massena's frontal attack. The French lost at least 1,500 killed and wounded. The Austrians, under Hiller, the same number killed and 7,000 prisoners. Pellet defends Massena and quotes the bulletin of May 4th, omitted from the correspondence. It is one of the finest feats of arms of which history can preserve the memory. The traveler will stop and say, it is here, in these superb positions, that an army of 35,000 Austrians was routed by 2 French divisions. Pellet, Roman 2. 225. Legend and most writers blame Massena, referring to the emperor's letter of May 1st in Pellet's Appendix, volume Roman 2, but not in the correspondence. Between April 17th and May 6th, there is no letter to Josephine preserved, but plenty to Eugene, and all severe not so much for incapacity as for not keeping the emperor advised of what was really happening. On May 6th, he had received no news for over a week. The ball that touched me, i.e., at Ratisbon. This was the second time Napoleon had been wounded in battle, the first time by an English bayonet at Toulon. On the present occasion, April 23rd, Maineville seems to be the best authority. Napoleon was seated on a spot from which he could see the attack on the town of Ratisbon. He was beating the ground with his riding whip when a bullet, supposed to have been fired from a Tyrolean carbine, struck him on the big toe. Marbot says right ankle, which is correct. The news of his wound spread rapidly from file to file, and he was forced to mount on horseback to show himself to his troops. Although his boot had not been cut, the contusion was a very painful one, and in the first house he went to for a moment's rest, he fainted. The next day, however, he saw the wounded and reviewed his troops as usual, and Lejeune has preserved a highly characteristic story, somewhat similar to an experience of the great Fredericks. When he had reached the 7th or 8th sergeant, the emperor noticed a handsome young fellow with fine but stern-looking eyes and of resolute and martial bearing, who made his musket ring again as he presented arms. "How many wounds?" inquired the emperor. 30, replied the sergeant. "I am not asking your age," said the emperor graciously. "I am asking how many wounds you have received." Raising his voice, the sergeant again replied with the one word 30. Annoyed at this reply, the emperor turned to the colonel and said, "The man does not understand. He thinks I am asking about his age." "He understands well enough, sire," was the reply. "He has been wounded 30 times. "What?" exclaimed the emperor. "You have been wounded so often and have not got the cross." The sergeant looked down at his chest, and seeing that the strap of his cartridge pouch hid his decoration, he raised it so as to show the cross. He said to the emperor with great earnestness, "Yes, I've got one, but I've merited a dozen." The emperor, who was always pleased to meet spirited fellows such as this, pronounced the sacramental words, "I make you an officer." "That's right, emperor," said the new sub-lieutenant as he proudly drew himself up. "You couldn't have done better." Number 3. Almost an exact duplicate of this letter goes on to Paris to Cambaceres, as also of number 4. The moment the emperor had heard that the archduke had left Budweis and was going by the circuitous route via Krems to Vienna, he left Enns, May 7th, and reached Molk the same evening. Seeing a camp of the enemy on the other side of the river, he sends Marbot with a sergeant and 6 picked men to kidnap a few Austrians during the night. The foray is successful, and 3 are brought before Napoleon, one weeping bitterly. The emperor asked the reason, and found it was because he had charge of his master's girdle and would be thought to have robbed him. The emperor had him set free and ferried across the river, saying, "We must honor and aid virtue wherever it shows itself." The next day he started for St. Polten, already evacuated by Hiller. On his way, he saw the ruins of Dürnstein Castle, where Richard Coeur de Lion had been imprisoned. The emperor's comments were interesting, but are now hackneyed, and are in most histories and memoirs, the parent source being Pellet, Volume Roman II, 246. Number 4. Schönbrunn, situated a mile from Vienna, across the little river of that name. Constant thus describes it. Built in 1754 by the Empress Marie Therese, Schönbrunn had an admirable position. Its architecture, if defective and irregular, was yet of a majestic, imposing type. To reach it, one has to cross the bridge across the little river Vienna. 4 stone sphinxes ornament this bridge, which is very large and well built. Facing the bridge there is a handsome gate opening on to a large courtyard, spacious enough for 7,000 or 8,000 men to maneuver in. The courtyard is in the form of a quadrangle, surrounded by covered galleries and ornamented with 2 large basins, in which are marble statues. On both sides of the gateway are 2 huge obelisks of pink stone surmounted by gilt eagles. In German, Schönbrunn means fair spring, and the name is derived from a fresh and sparkling spring which is situated in the park. It wells forth from a little mound on which a tiny grotto has been built, carved within so as to resemble stalactites. Inside the grotto is a recumbent naiad holding a horn, from which the water falls down into a marble basin. In summer, this little nook is deliciously cool. The interior of the palace merits nothing but praise. The furniture is sumptuous, and in taste both original and distinguished. The emperor's bedroom, the only place in the whole edifice where there was a chimney, was upholstered in Chinese lacquerwood of great antiquity, yet the painting and gilding were still quite fresh. The study adjoining was decorated in a like way. All these apartments, except the bedroom, were heated in winter by immense stoves, which sadly spoilt the effect of the other furniture. Between the study and the bedroom there was a strange apparatus called a flying chair, a sort of mechanical seat, which had been constructed for the Empress Marie Therese, and which served to transport her from one floor to another, so that she was not obliged to go up and down the staircase like everyone else. The machine was worked in the same way as at theaters, by cords, pulleys, and a counterweight. The emperor drank a glassful from the beautiful spring, Schönbrunn, every morning. Napoleon found the people of Vienna less favorable to the French than in 1805, and Count Rapp told him the people were everywhere tired of us and of our victories. He did not like these sort of reflections. May 12th on May 13th is dated the 7th bulletin of the Army of Germany, but none of the bulletins 2 to 6 are in the correspondence. It states that on the 10th he is before Vienna. The Archduke Maximilian refuses to surrender. On the 11th, at 9 p.m., the bombardment commences, and by daybreak the city capitulated, and the Archduke fled. In his proclamation, Napoleon blamed him and the House of Austria for the bombardment. While fleeing from the city, their adieus to the inhabitants have been murder and arson. Like Medea, they have with their own hands slain their children. The Viennese had sworn to emulate their ancestors in 1683 and the heroes of Saragossa. But Alison, than whom none can do the big bow wow, style better, has a thoughtful comment on what really occurred. All history demonstrates that there is one stage of civilization when the inhabitants of a metropolis are capable of such a sacrifice in defense of their country, and only one, and that when past, it is never recovered. The event has proved that the Russians, in 1812, were in the state of progress when such a heroic act was possible, but that the inhabitants of Vienna and Paris had passed it. Most certainly, the citizens of London would never have buried themselves under the ruins of the Bank, the Treasury, or Leadenhall Street before capitulating to Napoleon. 1870 and the Siege of Paris modify this judgment, but the Prussian bombardment came only at the last and barely reached the center of the city. Number 5. Ebersdorf, written 5 days after the murderous Battle of Essling. Montgillard, whose temper and judgment, as Alison remarks, are not equal to his talents, cannot resist a covert sneer, writing under the Bourbons at Napoleon's generalship on this occasion, although he adds a veneer by reminding us that Caesar was defeated at Dyrrhachium, Turenne at Marienthal, Eugene at Denain, Frederick the Great at Collin. The crossing of the river was one which none but a victorious army, with another about to join it, could afford to risk, but which having effected, the French had to make the best of. As Napoleon said in his 10th bulletin, the passage of a river like the Danube, in front of an enemy knowing perfectly the localities, and having the inhabitants on its side, is one of the greatest operations of war which it is possible to conceive. The Danube hereabouts is 1,000 yards broad and 30 feet deep. But the rising of its water 14 feet in 3 days was what no one had expected. At Ebersdorf, the first branch of the Danube was 500 yards across to an islet, thence 340 yards across the main, current to Lobau, the vast island 3 miles broad and nearly 3 miles long, separated from the farther bank by another 150 yards of Danube. Bertrand had made excellent bridges, but on the 22nd the main one was carried away by a floating mill. Eugene has completely performed the task. At the commencement of the campaign, the viceroy was taken unprepared. The Archduke John, exactly his own age, 27, was burning with hatred of France. Eugene had the impudence, with far inferior forces, to attack him at Sasel on April 16th, but was repulsed with a loss, including prisoners, of 6,000 men. It is now necessary to retire, and the Archduke follows him leisurely, almost within sight of Verona. By the end of April, the news of Eckmühl has reached both armies, and by May 1st the Austrians are in full retreat. As usual, Napoleon has already divined their altered plan of campaign, and writes from Braunau on this very day, "I doubt not that the enemy may have retired before you. It is necessary to pursue him with activity, whilst coming to join me as soon as possible via Carinthia. The junction with my army will probably take place beyond Bruck. It is probable I shall be at Vienna by the 10th to the 15th of May. It is the successful performance of this task of joining him and of driving back the enemy to which Napoleon alludes in the letter." The viceroy had been reproved for fighting at Sasel without his cavalry, for his precipitous retreat on Verona, and only 2 days earlier, the emperor had told him that if affairs went worse, he was to send for the King of Naples, Murat, to take command. "I am no longer grieved at the blunders you have committed, but because you do not write to me, and give me no chance of advising you, and even of regulating my own affairs here conformably." On May 8th, Eugene defeats the Austrians on the Piave, and the Archduke John loses nearly 10,000 men and 15 cannon. Harassed in their retreat, they regain their own territory on May 14th, the day after the capitulation of Vienna. Henceforward Eugene with part of the army, and MacDonald with the rest, force their way past all difficulties, so that when the junction with the Grand Army occurs at Bruck, Napoleon sends, May 27th, the following proclamation: "Soldiers of the Army of Italy, you have gloriously attained the goal that I marked out for you. Surprised by a perfidious enemy before your columns were united, you had to retreat to the Adige. But when you received the order to advance, you were on the memorable fields of Arcola, and there you swore on the manes of our heroes to triumph. You have kept your word at the Battle of the Piave, at the combats of San Daniel, Tarvis, and Goritz. You have taken by assault the forts of Malborghetto, of Predeel, and made the enemy's divisions, entrenched in Prewald and Laybach, surrender. You had not then passed the Drave, and already 25,000 prisoners, 60 cannon, and 10 flags signalized your valor. This is the proclamation alluded to in this letter to Josephine. Number 6. May 29th, the date is wrong. It should be May 19th or 24th, probably the latter. It sets at rest the vexed question how the Danube bridge was broken, and seems to confirm Marbott's version of a floating mill on fire, purposely sent down by an Austrian officer of Jaegers, who won the rare order of Maria Theresa thereby for performing more than his duty. Bertrand gained his emperor's lifelong admiration by his expedients at this time. Everything had to be utilized. Anchors for the boat bridges were made by filling fishermen's baskets with bullets, and a naval contingent of 1,200 bluejackets from Antwerp proved invaluable. Number 7. I have ordered the two princes to re-enter France after so critical a battle, as the Battle of Essling. The emperor's first thoughts were concerning his succession had he been killed or captured. He was therefore seriously annoyed that the heir apparent and his younger brother had both been taken out of the country without his permission. He therefore writes the Queen of Holland on May 28th from Ebersdorf. My daughter, I am seriously annoyed that you have left France without my permission, and especially that you have taken my nephews out of it. Since you are at Baden, stay there, but an hour after receiving the present letter, send my two nephews back to Strasbourg to be near the Empress. They ought never to go out of France. It is the first time I have had reason to be annoyed with you, but you should not dispose of my nephews without my permission. You should realize what a bad effect it will have. Since the waters at Baden are doing you good, you can stay there a few days, but, I repeat, lose not a moment in sending my nephews back to Strasbourg. If the Empress is going to the waters at Plombières, they may accompany her there, but they must never pass the bridge of Strasbourg. Your affectionate father, Napoleon. This letter passed through the hands of Josephine at Strasbourg, who was so unhappy at not having heard from her husband that she opened it, and writes to Hortense on June 1st when forwarding the letter. I advise you to write to him immediately that you have anticipated his intentions, and that your children are with me, that you have only had them a few days in order to see them, and to give them a change of air. The page who is announced in Maineval's letter has not yet arrived. I hope he will bring me a letter from the Emperor, and that at least he will not be as vexed with me for your being at Baden. Your children have arrived in excellent health. The Duke of Montebello, who died this morning the same day, he writes to La Maréchale as follows. Ma Cussain, the Marshal, died this morning of the wounds that he received on the field of honor. My sorrow equals yours. I lose the most distinguished general in my whole army, my comrade in arms for 16 years, he whom I looked upon as my best friend. His family and children will always have a special claim on my protection. It is to give you this assurance that I wish to write you this letter, for I feel that nothing can alleviate the righteous sorrow that you will experience. The following year, he bestowed the highest honor on the Maréchale that she could receive. Thus everything ends. The 14th bulletin says that the end was caused by a pernicious fever, and in spite of Dr. Frank, one of the best physicians in Europe. Thus ends one of the most distinguished soldiers France ever possessed. He had received 13 wounds. The death of Lannes, and the whole of the Essling period, is best told by Marbot. The loss of Lannes was a more serious one to Napoleon than the whole 20,000 men lost in this battle. The master himself has told us that, in war men are nothing, a man is everything. They could be replaced, Lannes never. Like Kleber and Desaix, he stood on a higher platform than the older marshals except Massena, who had serious drawbacks, and who was the only one of Napoleon's best generals that Wellington met in the peninsula. Lannes had always the ear of the emperor, and always told him facts, not flattery. His life had been specially crowded the last few weeks. Rebuked by Napoleon for tardiness in supporting Massena at Ebersberg, his life was saved by Napoleon himself when he was thrown from his horse into the flooded Danube. And finally, on the field of Essling, he had under his orders Bessières, the man who had a dozen years before prevented his engagement to Caroline Bonaparte by tittle-tattling to Napoleon. Number 9. Eugene won a battle. The remnant of the Archduke John's army, together with Hungarian levies, in all 31,000 men, hold the entrenched camp and banks of the Raab. Eugene defeats it, with a loss of 6,000 men, of whom 3,700 were prisoners. Napoleon, in commemoration of the anniversary of Marengo and Friedland, calls it the little granddaughter of Marengo. Number 11. The curtain of the war's final act was rung up in the 24th Bulletin. At length, there exists no longer the Danube for the French army. General Count Bertrand has completed works which excite astonishment and inspire admiration. For 800 yards over the most rapid river in the world, he has, in a fortnight, constructed a bridge of 16 arches where 3 carriages can pass abreast. Wagram is, according to Pellet, the masterpiece of tactical battles, while the 5 days' campaign, Thann to Ratisbon, was one long strategic battle. Nevertheless, respecting Wagram, had the Archduke John, with his 40,000 men, turned up, as the Archduke had more right to expect than Wellington had to expect Blücher, Waterloo might have been antedated 6 years. Lauzun was a prime favorite of Napoleon for his sure eye and active bearing. His capture of Stettin with 2 regiments of hussars was specially noteworthy. Like Lannes, he had a strong premonition of his death. Marbot tells a story of how Napoleon gave him 200,000 francs to get married with. A week later, the emperor asked, "When is the wedding?" "As soon as I have got some money to furnish with, sire." "Why, I gave you 200,000 francs to furnish with last week." "What have you done with them?" "Paid my debts with half, and lost the other half at cards." Such an admission would have ruined any other general. The emperor laughed, and merely giving a sharp tug at Lauzun's moustache, ordered Duroc to give him another 200,000. "I am sunburnt, and, as he writes Cambaceres the same day, tired out, having been 60 out of the previous 72 hours in the saddle." Number 12. Walkerstorff. On July 8 he writes General Clark, "I have the headquarters lately occupied by the craven Francis Roman II, who contented himself with watching the whole affair from the top of a tower, 10 miles from the scene of battle." On this day also he dictated his 25th bulletin, of which the last portion is so skillfully utilized in the last scene of Act 5. In l'Aiglon. One concluding sentence is all that can here be quoted. Such is the recital of the Battle of Wagram, a decisive and ever illustrious battle, where 300,000 to 400,000 men, 12 to 1,500 guns, fought for great stakes on a field of battle, studied, meditated on, and fortified by the enemy for many months. A surfeit of bile his usual source of relief after extra work or worry. In this case, both. Bernadotte had behaved so badly at Wagram that Napoleon sent him to Paris with the stern rebuke, "A bungler like you is no good to me." But as usual, his anger against an old comrade is short-lived, and he gives General Clark permission to send Bernadotte to command at Antwerp against the English. Number 16. My affairs follow my wishes in Austria, possibly, but not elsewhere. Prussia was seething with conspiracy, Russia with ill-concealed hatred, the English had just landed in Belgium, and Wellesley had just won Talavera. Soult was apparently no longer trustworthy, Bernadotte a conceited boaster, who had to be publicly snubbed. See the order of the day, August 5th, number 15,614. Clark and Cambaceres are so slow that Napoleon writes them, August 10th, not to let the English come and take you in bed. Fouché shows more energy than everyone else put together, calls out National Guards, and sends them off to meet the northern invasion. The Minister of the Interior, M. Cretet, had just died, and the Emperor had wisely put Fouché, the most competent man available, into his place for the time being. Number 17. August 21st, the list of birthday honors. August 15th had been a fairly long one, Berthier becoming Prince of Wagram, Maecenas of Essling, Davoust of Eckmühl. Marshals Oudinot and MacDonald, Generals Clark, Rainier, Gaudin, and Champagny, as also M. Merritt, became dukes. Marmont had already, says Savary, been made delirious with the joy of possessing a baton. Number 18. Comedians Napoleon found relaxation more after his own heart in conversing with the savants of Germany, including the great mechanic Maelzel, with whose automaton chess player he played a game. Constant gives a highly colored picture of the sequel. The automaton was seated before a chessboard, and the emperor, taking a chair opposite the figure, said laughingly, "Now, my friend, we'll have a game." The automaton, bowing, made signs for the emperor to begin. After 2 or 3 moves, the emperor made a wrong one on purpose. The automaton bowed and replaced the piece on the board. His Majesty cheated again when the automaton bowed again, but this time took the pawn. "Quite right," said His Majesty, as he promptly cheated for the third time. The automaton then shook its head, and with one sweep of its hand knocked all the chessmen down. Women, not having been presented one woman, however, the mistress of Lord Paget, was quite willing to be presented at a late hour, and to murder him at the same time at least, so says Constant. Number 19. All this is very suspicious for perfectly natural reasons. Caesar's wife was now above suspicion, but Caesar himself was not so. Madame Walewski had been more than a month at Schönbrunn, and on May 4, 1810, Napoleon has a second son born, who 50 years later helped to edit his father's correspondence. Number 20. Kremsy left here to review Davoust's corps on the field of Austerlitz. Afterwards all the generals dined with him, and the emperor said, "This is the second time I come upon the field of Austerlitz. Shall I come to it a third time?" "Sire," replied one, "from what we see every day none dare wager that you will not." It was this suppressed hatred that probably determined the emperor to dismantle the fortifications of Vienna, an act that intensified the hatred of the Viennese more than his allowing the poor people to help themselves to wood for the winter in the imperial forests had mollified them. My health has never been better. His reason for this remark is found in his letter to Cambyses of the same date. "They have spread in Paris the rumor that I was ill. I know not why. I was never better." The reason of the rumor was that Corvisart had been sent for to Vienna, as there had been an outbreak of dysentery among the troops. This was kept a profound secret from France, and Napoleon even allowed Josephine to think that Corvisart had attended him. See Letter 22. Number 23. October 14th, 2 days before, Stabs, the young Tugendbundist and an admirer of Joan of Arc, had attempted to assassinate Napoleon on parade with a carving knife. The emperor's letter to Fouché of the 12th October gives the most succinct account. "Youth of 17, son of a Lutheran minister of Erfurt, sought to approach me on parade today. He was arrested by the officers, and as the little man's agitation had been noticed, suspicion was aroused. He was searched, and a dagger found upon him. I had him brought before me, and the little wretch, who seemed to me fairly well educated, told me that he wished to assassinate me to deliver Austria from the presence of the French. I could distinguish in him neither religious nor political fanaticism. He did not appear to know exactly who or what Brutus was. The fever of excitement he was in prevented our knowing more. He will be examined when he has cooled down and fasted. It is possible that it will come to nothing. He will be arraigned before a military commission. I wish to inform you of this circumstance in order that it may not be made out more important than it appears to be. I hope it will not leak out. If it does, we shall have to represent the fellow as a madman. If it is not spoken of at all, keep it to yourself. The whole affair made no disturbance at the parade. I myself saw nothing of it. P.S. I repeat once more, and you understand clearly, that there is to be no discussion of this occurrence. Count Rapp saved the emperor's life on this occasion, and he, Savary, and Constant all give detailed accounts. Their narratives are a remarkable object lesson of the carelessness of the average contemporary spectator in recording dates. Savary gives vaguely the end of September, Constant October 13th, and Count Rapp October 23rd. In the present case, the date of this otherwise trivial incident is important, for careless historians assert that it influenced Napoleon in concluding peace. In any case, it would have taken 20 such occurrences to affect Napoleon one hairbreadth, and in the present instance, his letter of October 10th to the Russian emperor proves that the peace was already settled all but the signing. Number 24. Stuttgart, General Rapp describes this journey as follows. Peace was ratified. We left Nymphenburg and arrived at Stuttgart. Napoleon was received in a style of magnificence and was lodged in the palace together with his suite. The king was laying out a spacious garden, and men who had been condemned to the galleys were employed to labor in it. The emperor asked the king who the men were who worked in chains. He replied that they were for the most part rebels who had been taken in his new possessions. We set out on the following day. On the way, Napoleon alluded to the unfortunate wretches whom he had seen at Stuttgart. "The king of Württemberg," said he, "is a very harsh man, but he is very faithful. Of all the sovereigns in Europe, he possesses the greatest share of understanding." We stopped for an hour at Rastatt, where the Princess of Baden and Princess Stephanie had arrived for the purpose of paying their respects to the emperor. The Grand Duke and Duchess accompanied him as far as Strasbourg. On his arrival in that city, he received dispatches which again excited his displeasure against the Faubourg Saint-Germain. We proceeded to Fontainebleau. No preparations had been made for the emperor's reception. There was not even a guard on duty. This was on October 26th. At 10 a.m., Mayneville asserts that Napoleon's subsequent bad temper was feigned. In any case, the meeting that moment so impatiently awaited was a very bad court d'honneur for Josephine, accentuated doubtless by Fouché's report of bad conduct on the part of the ladies of Saint-Germain. Series M. Number 1. According to the correspondence of Napoleon I, number 16058, the date of this letter is December 17th. It seems, however, possible that it is the letter written immediately after his arrival at Trianon, referred to by Mayneville, who was, in fact, responsible for it. Thiers, working from unpublished memoirs of Hortense and Cambacérès, gives a most interesting account of the family council, held at 9 p.m. on Friday, December 15th, at the Tuileries. Constant also describes the scene, but gives the Empress credit for showing the most self-command of those chiefly interested. The next day, 11 a.m., Count Lassipede introduced the resolutions of the family council to the Senatus Consultus. It is today that, more than ever before, the emperor has proved that he wishes to reign only to serve his subjects, and that the Empress has merited that posterity should associate her name with that of Napoleon. He pointed out that 13 of Napoleon's predecessors had broken the bonds of matrimony in order to fulfill better those of sovereign, and that among these were the most admired and beloved of French monarchs Charlemagne, Philip Augustus, Louis Roman XII, and Henry Roman IV. This speech and the decrees, carried by 76 votes to 7, are found in the Moniteur of December 17th, which Napoleon considers sufficiently authentic to send to his brother Joseph as a full account of what occurred, and with no further comment of his own, but that it was the step which he thought it his duty to take. The decrees of the Committee of the Senate were: 1. The marriage contracted between the Emperor Napoleon and the Empress Josephine is dissolved. 2. The Empress Josephine will retain the titles and rank of a crowned Empress Queen. 3. Her jointure is fixed at an annual revenue of £80,000 from the public treasury. 4. Every provision which may be made by the Emperor in favor of the Empress Josephine, out of the funds of the civil list, shall be obligatory on his successors. They added separate addresses to the Emperor and Empress, and that to the latter seems worthy of quotation. Your Imperial and Royal Majesty is about to make for France the greatest of sacrifices. History will preserve the memory of it forever. The august spouse of the greatest of monarchs cannot be united to his immortal glory by more heroic devotion. For long, Madame, the French people has revered your virtues. It holds dear that loving kindness which inspires your every word as it directs your every action. It will admire your sublime devotion. It will award forever to your Majesty, Empress and Queen, the homage of gratitude, respect, and love. From a letter of Eugene's to his wife, quoted by Aubinas, it appears that he, with his mother, arrived at Malmaison on Saturday evening, December 16th, and that it never ceased raining all the next day, which added to the general depression, in spite of, or because of, Eugene's bad puns. On the evening of the 16th, Napoleon was at Trianon, writing letters, and we cannot think that if the Emperor had been to Malmaison on the Sunday, Eugene would have included this without comment in the some visits they had received. The Emperor, as we see from the next letter, paid Josephine a visit on the Monday. Number 2. The date of this is Tuesday, December 19th, while number 3 is Wednesday the 20th. Savary, always unpopular with the court ladies, has now nothing but kind words for Josephine. She quitted the court, but the court did not quit her. It had always loved her, for never had anyone been so kind. She never injured anyone in the time of her power. She protected even her enemies, such as Fouché at this juncture, and Lucien earlier. During her stay at Malmaison, the highroad from Paris to this Chateau was only one long procession, in spite of the bad weather. Everyone considered it a duty to present themselves at least once a week. Later, Marie-Louise became jealous of this, and poor Josephine had to go to the Chateau of Navarre and finally to leave France. Queen of Naples. For some reason, Napoleon had not wanted this sister at Paris this winter, and had written her to this effect from Schönbrunn on October 15th. If you were not so far off, and the season so advanced, I would have asked Murat to spend 2 months in Paris. But you cannot be there before December, which is a horrible season, especially for a Neapolitan. But Sister Caroline, with the head of a Cromwell on the shoulders of a pretty woman, was not easy to lead, and her husband had in consequence to bear the full weight of the emperor's displeasure. Murat's finances were in disorder, and Napoleon wrote Champagny on December 30th to tell Murat plainly that if the borrowed money was not returned to France, it would be taken by main force. The hunt in pouring rain, in the forest of Saint-Germain. Number 4. Thursday, December 21st, is the date. The weather is very damp, making Malmaison as unhealthy as its very name warranted, and rendering more difficult the task which Madame de Rémusat had set herself of resting Josephine mentally by tiring her physically. This typical toady Napoleon's eavesdropper extraordinary had arrived at Malmaison on December 18th. She writes on the Friday, December 22nd, beseeching her husband to advise the emperor to moderate the tone of his letters, especially this one, Thursday, December 21st, which had upset Josephine frightfully. Surely a more harmless letter was never penned. But it is the Rémusat all over. She lives in a chronic atmosphere of suspicion that all her letters are read by the emperor, and therefore, like Stevenson's nursery rhymes, they are always written with one eye on the grown-up person par excellence of France and the century. The opening of letters by the government was doubtless a blemish, which, however, Napoleon tried to neutralize by entrusting the post office to his wife's relative, Lavalette, a man whose ever-kind heart prevented this necessary espionage degenerating into unnecessary interference with individual rights. Number 5. Date probably Sunday, December 24th. King of Bavaria. Eugene had gone to Meaux to meet his father-in-law, who had put off the dog's humor which he had shown since the 16th. Number 6. Josephine had gone by special invitation to dine at the Little Trianon with Napoleon on Christmas Day, and Madame d'Avrelin says she had a very happy day there. On her return, she told me how kind the emperor had been to her, that he had kept her all the evening, saying the kindest things to her. Albinaz says, the repast was eaten in silence and gloom, but does not give his authority. Eugene, moreover, confirms Madame d'Avrelin in his letter to his wife of December 26th. My dear Auguste, the emperor came on Sunday to see the empress. Yesterday she went to Trianon to see him and stayed to dinner. The emperor was very kind and amiable to her, and she seemed to be much better. Everything points to the empress being more happy in her new position, and we also. On this Christmas Day, Napoleon had his last meal with Josephine. Number 7. Tuileries. His return from Trianon to this, his official residence, made the divorce more apparent to everyone. Number 8. A house vacant in Paris. This seems a hint for Josephine. She wishes to come to Paris, to the Élysée, and to try a little diplomacy of her own in favor of the Austrian match, and she sends secretly to Madame de Metternich, whose husband was absent. Eugene more officially is approaching Prince Schwarzenberg, the ambassador. Josephine, like Talleyrand, wished to heal the schism with Rome by an Austrian alliance, while Cambaceres, foreseeing a war with the power not allied by marriage, would have preferred the Russian match. Number 9. Thursday, January 4th. Hortense, Louis had tried to obtain a divorce. Cambaceres was ordered on December 22nd to summon a family council, New Letters of Napoleon I, number 234. But the wish of the king was refused, verbally, says Louis in his Historical Documents of Holland, whereupon he refused to agree to Josephine's divorce, but had to give way, and was present at what he calls the farewell festival given by the city of Paris to the Empress Josephine on January 1st. The ecclesiastical divorce was pronounced on January 12th. Number 10. January 5th, he duly visits Josephine the next day. Number 11. January 7th is the date. What charms your society has her repertoire of small talk and scandal. He had also lost in her his agenda, his Journal of Paris. Still the visits are growing rarer. This long, kind letter was doubtless intended to be specially so, for 2 days later the clergy of Paris pronounced the annulment of her marriage. This was far worse than the pronouncement by the Senate in December, as it meant to her that she and Napoleon had never been properly married at all. The emperor, who hated divorces, and especially divorcees, had found great difficulty in breaking down the barriers he had helped to build, for which purpose he had to be subordinated to his own Senate, the Pope to his own bishops. 7 of them allowed the annulment of the marriage of 1804 on account of 1. Its secrecy, 2. The insufficiency of consent of the contracting parties, and 3. The absence of the local parish priest at the ceremony. The last reason was merely a technical one, but with respect to the first 2, it is only fair to admit that Napoleon had undoubtedly, and perhaps for the only time in his life, been completely rushed, i.e. by the Pope and Josephine. The coronation ceremony was waiting, and the Pope, secretly solicited by Josephine, insisted on a religious marriage first and foremost. The Pope suffered forthwith, but the other bill of costs was not exacted till 5 years after date. Number 12. Wednesday, January 12th. King of Westphalia Madame Durand, Napoleon and Marie-Louise, says that, forced to abandon his wife, the beautiful and energetic Miss Patterson, and child, Jerome, had vowed he would never have any relations with a wife who had been thus forced upon him. For 3 years he lavished his attentions upon almost all the beauties of the Westphalian court. The Queen, an eyewitness of this conduct, bore it with mild and forbearing dignity. She seemed to see and hear nothing. In short, her demeanor was perfect. King, touched by her goodness, weary of his conquests and repentant of his behavior, was only anxious for an opportunity of altering the state of things. Happily, the propitious moment presented itself. The right wing of the palace of Castle, in which the Queen's apartments were situated, took fire. Alarmed by the screams of her women, the Queen awoke and sprang out of her bed, to be caught in the arms of the King and carried to a place of safety. From that time forth, the royal couple were united and happy. Number 13. Saturday, January 13th. Sensible this was now possible after a month's mourning. In the early days, according to Madame Rémusat, her mind often wandered, but Napoleon himself encouraged the court to visit her, and the road to Malmaison was soon a crowded one. As the days passed, however, life became sadly monotonous. Reading palled on Josephine, as did whist and the daily feeding of her golden pheasants and guinea fowls. Remained patience. Was it the general she played or the emperor, or did she find distraction in the demon? Number 14. Dodinard, Napoleon's handsome equerry, whom Emile d'Avrelin calls un homme superbe. His mother was Josephine's favorite Dame du Palais. Madame Lalling, Viscountess Dodinard, née Peyrac, was one of the old regime who had been ruined by the Revolution. Number 16. Tuesday, January 23rd. On January 21st, a Privy Council was summoned to approve of Marie-Louise as their choice of a consort, who may give an heir to the throne, Thiers. Cambacérès, Fouché, and Murat wished for the Russian princess, Lebrun, Cardinal Fesch, and King Louis for a Saxon one, but Talleyrand, Champagny, Marat, Berthier, Fontaines were for Austria. Number 17. Sunday, January 28th. Number 18. Josephine had heard she was to be banished from Paris, and so had asked to come to the Élysée to prove the truth or otherwise of the rumor. L'Élysée, Saint Amand gives the following interesting précis. Built by the Count d'Evreux in 1718, it had belonged in succession to the Marchioness de Pompadour, to the financier Beaujon, a Croesus of the 18th century, and to the Duchesse de Bourbon. Having, under the Revolution, become national property, it had been hired by the caterers of public entertainments, who gave it the name of L'Élysée. In 1803, it became the property of Murat, who, becoming King of Naples, ceded it to Napoleon in 1808. Here Napoleon signed his second abdication. Here resided Alexander I in 1815, and here Josephine's grandson effected the coup d'état, 1851. When the Senatus Consultus fixed the revenue of Josephine, Napoleon not only gave her whatever rights he had in Malmaison, viz., at least 90% of the total cost, but the palace of the Élysée, its gardens and dependencies, with the furniture then in use. The latter residence was, however, for her life only. Number 19. February 3rd is the date. L'Élysée, after the first receptions, the place is far worse than Malmaison. Schwarzenberg, Talleyrand, the Princess Pauline, Berthier, even her old friend Cambacérès are giving balls, while the emperor goes nearly every night to a theater. The carriages pass by the Élysée, but do not stop. It is as if the palace were in quarantine with the yellow flag floating. Number 20. Bessieres country house M. Masson says Grignon, but unless this house is called after the château of that name in Provence, he must be mistaken. Number 21. Rambouillet he had taken the court with him, and was there from February 19th to the 23rd, the date of this letter. While there, he had been in the best of humors. On his return, he finds it necessary to write his future wife, and to her fatherland to pen a legible letter to the latter gives him far more trouble than winning a battle against the Austrians, if not assisted by General Danube. Adieu sick and weary, Josephine returns to Malmaison, Friday, March 9th, and even this is not long to be hers, for the new empress is almost already on her way. The marriage at Vienna took place on March 11th with her uncle Charles, the hero of Essling, for Napoleon's proxy. On the 13th she leaves Vienna, and on the 23rd reaches Strasbourg. On the 27th, she meets Napoleon at Compiègne, spends 3 days with him in the château there, and arrives at St. Cloud on April 1st, where the civil marriage is renewed, followed by the triumphal entry into Paris and the religious ceremony on April 2nd. This day Josephine reaches the château of Navarre. Series N. Navarre, on the site of an old dwelling of Rollo the Sea King, was built by Jeanne of France, Queen of Navarre, Countess of Evreux. At the time of the Revolution it belonged to the Dukes of Bouillon and was confiscated. In February 1810, Napoleon determined to purchase it, and on March 10th instructed his Secretary of State, Marat, to confer the Duchy of Navarre, purchased by letters patent, on Josephine and her heirs male. The old square building was, however, utterly unfit to be inhabited. Not a window would shut, there was neither paper nor tapestry, all the wainscoting was rotten, draughts and damp everywhere, and no heating apparatus. What solace to know its beautiful situation, its capabilities. No wonder if her household, banished to such a place, 65 miles from the capital of capitals, should rebel, and secessions headed by Madame Ney become for a time general. Whist and piquet soon grow stale in such a house, and with such surroundings, and even trick-track with the old bishop of Evreux becomes tedious. Eugene, as usual, brings sunshine in his path, and helps to dispel the gloom caused by the idle gossip imported from Paris that Josephine is not to return to Malmaison, and the like. Number 1. This was Josephine's second letter, says Daverlin, the first being answered viva voce by Eugene. To Malmaison, Napoleon had promised Josephine permission to return to Malmaison, and would not recant. His new wife was, however, very jealous of Josephine, and very much hurt at her presence at Malmaison. Napoleon managed to be away from Paris for 6 weeks after Josephine's arrival at Malmaison. Number 1a. It is written in a bad stylem. Masson, however, is loud in its praises, and adds, Voilà donc le protocole du tutoiement, re-established between them in spite of the second marriage, and their correspondence re-established on the old terms. Number 2. This letter seems to have been taken by Eugene to Paris, and thence forwarded to the emperor with a letter from that prince in which he enumerates Josephine's suggestions and wishes. 1. That she will not go to Aix-la-Chapelle if other waters are suggested by Corvisart. 2. That after stopping a few days at Malmaison, she will go in June for 3 months to the baths, and afterwards to the south of France. Visit Rome, Florence, and Naples incognito, spend the winter at Milan, and return to Malmaison and Navarre in the spring of 1811. 3. That in her absence Navarre shall be made habitable, for which fresh funds are required. 4. That Josephine wishes her cousins the Tashers to marry, one a relative of King Joseph, the other the Princess Amélie de la Layen, niece of the Prince Primate. To this Napoleon replies from Compiègne, April 26th, that the de Layen match with Louis Tascher may take place, but that he will not interest himself in the other Henry Tascher, who is giddy-headed and bad-tempered. I consent to whatever the Empress does, but I will not confer any mark of my regard on a person who has behaved ill to me. I am very glad that the Empress likes Navarre. I am giving orders to have £12,000 which I owe her for 1810, and £12,000 for 1811 advanced to her. She will then have only the £80,000 from the public treasury to come in. She is free to go to whatever spa she cares for, and even to return to Paris afterwards. He thinks, however, she would be happier in new scenes which they had never visited together, as they had Aix-la-Chapelle. If, however, the last are the best, she may go to them, for what I desire above all is that she may keep calm and not allow herself to be excited by the gossip of Paris. This letter goes far to soothe the poor chatelaine of Navarre. No, 2a. 2 letters the other, now missing, may have some reference to the pictures to which he refers in his letter to Fauchet the next day. Is it true that engravings are being published with the title of Josephine Beauharnais' Ne la Pagerie? If this is true, have the prints seized, and let the engravers be punished. New letters, no, 253. Number 3. Probably written from Boulogne about the 25th. His northern tour with Marie-Louise had been very similar to one taken in 1804, but his entourage found the new bride very cold and callous compared to Josephine. Leaving Paris on April 29th, Napoleon's correspondence till June is dated Leeken April 30th, Antwerp May 3rd, Bois-le-Duc, Middelburg, Gand, Bruges, Ostend May 20th, Lille, Boulogne, Dieppe, Le Havre, Rouen May 31st. He takes the Empress in a canal barge from Brussels to Malines and himself descends the subterranean vault of the Escautois Canal between St. Quentin and Cambrai. He is at St. Cloud on June 2nd. Josephine has felt his wanderings less, as she has the future emperor, her favorite grandson, with her, the little wee-wee, as she calls him, and for whom the damp spring weather of Holland was dangerous. She was also at Malmaison from the middle of May to June 18th. The original collection of letters, Didat Freres, 1833, heads the letter correctly to the Empress Josephine at Malmaison, but the correspondence, published by order of Napoleon Roman III, gives it erroneously to the Empress Josephine at the Château of Navarre, number 16,537. I will come to see you. He comes for 2 hours on June 13th and makes himself thoroughly agreeable. Poor Josephine is light-headed with joy all the evening after. The meeting of the 2 empresses is, however, indefinitely postponed, and Josephine had now no further reason to delay her departure. Leaving her little grandson Louis behind, she travels under the name of the Countess d'Arbourg, and she is accompanied by Madame d'Audenard and Emile de Mackau, who left the Princess Stephanie to come to Navarre. M. Masson notes that Madame de Rémusat needs the Aix waters and will rejoin Josephine within a week, under pretext of service, and thus obtain her cure gratuitously. They go via Lyon and Geneva to Aix-les-Bains. M. Masson, who has recently made a careful and complete study of this period, describes the daily round. Josephine, on getting out of bed, takes conscientiously her baths and douches, then, as usual, lies down again until déjeuner, 11 a.m., for which the whole of the little court are assembled at the palace wherever she lives, and however squalid the dwelling place, her abode always bears this name. Afterwards she and her womenfolk ply their interminable tapestry, while the latest novel or play, sent by Barbier from Paris, is read aloud. And so the day passes till 5, when they dress for dinner at 6, after dinner a ride. At 9 the Empress's friends assemble in her room. Emile de Mackau sings. At 11 everyone goes to bed. This program, however, varies with the weather. Here is Saint Amand's version, Dernières années de l'impératrice Joséphine, p. 237. A little reading in the morning, an airing, la promenade afterwards, dinner at 8 on account of the heat, games afterwards, and some little music, so passed existence. Number 4. July 8th on July 5th, driving along the Chambry Road, Josephine met the courier with a letter from Eugene describing the terrible fire at Prince Schwarzenberg's ball, where the Princess de la Layen, mother of young Tascher's bride-elect, was burnt. It is noteworthy that the emperor makes no allusion to the conflagration. As, however, this is the first letter since the end of May, others may have been lost or destroyed. You will have seen Eugene I.E. on his way to Milan, who arrived at Aix on July 10th. He had just been made heir to the Grand Duchy of Frankfurt, a broad hint to him, and to Europe that Italy would be eventually united to France under Napoleon's dynasty. This was the nadir of the Beauharnais family. Josephine repudiée, Hortense unqueened and unwed, and Eugene's expectations dissipated, and all within a few short months. Eugene had left his wife ill at Geneva, whither Josephine goes to visit her the next day, duly reporting her visit to Napoleon in her letter of July 14th. See number 5. Geneva was always the home of the disaffected, and so the empress had to be specially tactful, and the de Rémusat reports. She speaks of the emperor as of a brother, of the new empress as the one who will give children to France, and if the rumors of the latter's condition be correct, I am certain she will be delighted about it. That unfortunate daughter is coming to France, to reside when she is not at Saint Leu, given to her by Napoleon, or at the waters. On the present occasion, she has been at Plombières a month or more. On July 10th, Napoleon instructs the Countess de Baubers to bring the Grand Duke of Berg to Paris, whom he awaits with impatience. Breton, 625. Number 5. The conduct of the King of Holland has worried me. This was in March, and by May the crisis was still more acute and Napoleon's patience exhausted. On May 20th he writes, "Before all things be a Frenchman and the Emperor's brother, and then you may be sure you are in the path of the true interests of Holland. Good sense and policy are necessary to the government of states, not sour, unhealthy bile." And 3 days later, "Write me no more of your customary twaddle. 3 years now it has been going on, and every instant proves its falsehood. This is the last letter I shall ever write you in my life." Louis at one time determined on war, and rather than surrender Amsterdam, to cut the dikes. The emperor hears of this, summons his brother, and practically imprisons him until he countermands the defense of Amsterdam. On July 1st, Louis abdicated and fled to Toplitz in Bohemia. Napoleon is terribly grieved at the conduct of his brother, who would never realize that the effective continental blockade was Napoleon's last sheet-anchor to force peace upon England. Number 6. To die in a Lacaille. The Lake of Birget, shut in by the Dent du Chat, where a white squall had nearly capsized the sailing boat. Josephine had been on July 26th to visit the Abbey Hautecombe, place of sepulture of the princes of Savoy, and the storm had overtaken her on the return voyage. Number 8. Paris, this Friday. A very valuable note of M. Masson, Josephine Repudie, 198, enables us to fix this letter at its correct date. He says, "It has to do with the exile of Madame de la T. viz. the Princess Louis de la Trémol, which takes place on September 28, 1810, and this 28th September is also a Friday. There is also the question of Emile de Macau being made a baroness, and this lady had not joined the court of Josephine till May 1810. Lastly, the B mentioned therein can only be Barante, the prefect, whose dismissal, from Geneva, almost coincides with this letter. It may be added that the La Trémol family was one of the oldest in France, allied with the Condés, and consequently with the Bourbons. Barante's fault had been connivance at the letters and conduct of Madame de Staël. Number 9. The only suitable places are either Milan or Navarre. Had been her own suggestion conveyed by Eugene, but Napoleon, 2 months later, had told her she could spend the winter in France, and in spite of danger signals, inspired by diplomacy rather than devotion, from Madame de Rémusat, in her fulsome and tedious dispatch, sent from Paris in September, and probably inspired by the emperor himself, she manages to get to Navarre, and even to spend the first fortnight of November at Malmaison. Before leaving Switzerland, Josephine refuses to risk an interview with Madame de Staël. In the first book she publishes, she will not fail to report our conversation, and heaven knows how many things she will make me say that I have never even thought of. Number 10. In spite of the heading, Josephine was at Malmaison on this day, and Napoleon writes Cambaceres, "My cousin, the Empress Josephine, not leaving for Navarre till Monday or Tuesday. I wish you to pay her a visit. You will let me know on your return how you find her." Breton, 721. The real reason is to hasten her departure, and she gets to Navarre November 22nd, Thursday. The Empress progresses satisfactorily. Napoleon writes to this effect to her father, the Emperor of Austria, on the same day. "The Empress is very well. It is impossible that the wife for whom I am indebted to you should be more perfect. Moreover, I beg your Majesty to rest assured that she and I are equally attached to you." Series O. Number 1. The New Year. On this occasion, instead of her usual gifts, étrennes, she organized a lottery of jewels, of which Madame Ducrest gives a full account. Needless to say, Josephine worked the oracle so that everyone got a suitable gift, including the old bishop. See next note. More women than men. The Bishop of Evreux Mgr. Berlier was the most welcome guest. He amused Josephine, and although 80 years of age, could play trick-track and talk well on any subject. Madame de Rémusat wrote her husband concerning him, "We understand each other very well, he and I." Keep well at Navarre. Josephine lost her headaches and put on flesh. Number 2. There is a full account of the birth of the King of Rome in Napoleon's letter to the Emperor of Austria on March 20, number 17,496. The letter of this date to Josephine is missing, but is referred to by Daverlin. It began, "My dear Josephine, I have a son. I am au comble de Ben-Hur." Josephine much appreciated this allusion. "Is it possible," she said, "for anyone to be kinder than the emperor, and more anxious to mitigate whatever might be painful for me at the present moment, if I loved him less sincerely? This association of my son with his own is well worthy of him who, when he likes, is the most fascinating of all men." She gave a costly ring to the page who brought the letter. On the previous day, Eugene had arrived at Navarre sent by the emperor. "You are going to see your mother, Eugene. Tell her I am sure that she will rejoice more than anyone at my happiness. I should have already written to her if I had not been absorbed by the pleasure of watching my boy. The moments I snatch from his side are only for matters of urgent necessity. This event, I shall acquit myself of the most pleasant of them all by writing to Josephine." Number 4. Written in November 1811. As fat as a good Normandy farmeress, Madame de Brantz, who saw her about this time, writes, "I observed that Josephine had grown very stout since the time of my departure for Spain. This change was at once for the better and the worse. It imparted a more youthful appearance to her face, but her slender and elegant figure, which had been one of her principal attractions, had entirely disappeared. She had now decided embonpoint, and her figure had assumed that matronly air which we find in the statues of Agrippina, Cornelia, and see still, however, she looked uncommonly well, and she wore a dress which became her admirably. Her judicious taste in these matters contributed to make her appear young much longer than she otherwise would. The best proof of the admirable taste of Josephine is the marked absence of elegance shown by Marie Louise, though both empresses employed the same milliners and dressmakers, and Marie Louise had a large sum allotted for the expenses of her toilet. St. Ammon says that 1811 was for Josephine a happy year, compared to those which followed. Series P. Number 1. Written from Königsberg, M. Masson in Josephine Repudiae, says Danzig, but on June 11th Napoleon writes to Eugene, "I shall be at Königsberg tomorrow," where his correspondence is dated from henceforward. A day or two later, he writes the King of Rome's governess that he trusts to hear soon that the 15-months-old child has cut his first 4 teeth. Number 2. Gumbinnen, June 20th from this place, and on this date goes forth the first bulletin of the Grande Armée. It gives a résumé of the causes of the war, dating from the end of 1810, when English influence again gained ascendancy. On July 29th, he writes Hortense from Weipzig to congratulate her on her eldest son's recovery from an illness. A week later, he writes his librarian for some amusing novels, new ones for choice, or old ones that he has not read, or good memoirs. Josephine, meanwhile, has permission to go to Italy. Owing to her grandson's illness, she defers starting till July 16th. Through frightful weather, she reaches Milan via Geneva on July 28th and has a splendid reception. On the 29th, she writes to Hortense, "I have found the 3 letters from Eugene, the last one dated the 13th. His health is excellent. He still pursues the Russians, without being able to overtake them. It is generally hoped the campaign may be a short one." May that hope be realized. 2 days later, she announces the birth of Eugene's daughter Amelia, afterwards Empress of Brazil. Towards the end of August, Josephine goes to Aix and meets the Queen of Spain with her sister Désirée Bernadotte, the former kind and amiable as usual, the latter, very gracious to me, rather a new experience. From Aix she goes to Prégny-la-Tour, on the Lake of Geneva, and shocks the good people in various ways, says M. Masson, especially by innuendos against Napoleon, and he adds, "If one traces back to their source the worst calumnies against the morals of the emperor, it is Josephine that one encounters there." She gets to Malmaison October 24th. Soon after his return from Moscow, Napoleon pays her a visit, And about this time, she begins to see the King of Rome, whose mother has always thought more of her daily music and drawing lessons than of whether she was making her son happy or not. 1812 closed in gloom, but 1813 was in itself terribly ominous to so superstitious a woman as Josephine. 13 is always unlucky, and moreover the numbers of 1813 add up to 13. Also the doom-dealing year began on a Friday. Everyone felt the hour approaching. As Napoleon said at St. Helena, "The star grew pale, I felt the reins slipping from my hand, and I could do no more." A thunderbolt could alone have saved us, and every day, by some new fatality or other, our chances diminished. Sinister designs began to creep in among us. Fatigue and discouragement had won over the majority. My lieutenants became lax, clumsy, careless, and consequently unfortunate. They were no longer the men of the commencement of the revolution, nor even of the time of my good fortune. The chief generals were sick of the war. I had gorged them too much with my high esteem, with too many honors and too much wealth. They had drunk from the cup of pleasure and wished to enjoy peace at any price. The sacred fire was quenched. Up to August fortune had smiled again upon her favorite. With conscripts for infantry and without cavalry, he had won Lutzen, Botzen, and Dresden. And even so late as September Byron was writing that, bar epilepsy and the elements, he would back Napoleon against the field. But treachery and incompetence had undermined the empire, and Leipzig, that battle of giants, where 110,000 soldiers were killed and wounded, made final success hopeless. In 1814, his brothers Lucien and Louis rallied to him, and Hortense was for the only time proud of her husband. She thinks if he had shown less suspicion and she less pride, they might have been happy after all. "My husband is a good Frenchman. He is an honest man." Meanwhile, Talleyrand is watching to guide the coup de grace. Napoleon makes a dash for Lorraine to gather his garrisons and cut off the enemy's supplies. The Allies hesitate and are about to follow him, as per the rules of war. Talleyrand, the only man who could ever divine Napoleon, sends them the message, "You can do everything and you dare nothing, dare therefore once." Hortense is the only man left in Paris, and in vain she tries to keep Marie-Louise, whose presence would have stimulated the Parisians to hold the Allies at bay. It is in vain. Unlike Prussia or Austria, who fought for months, or Spain, who fought for years, after their capitals were taken. Like Nineveh, Carthage, Babylon, and Rome, France yields to the conqueror, vanquished at home. After Marmont's betrayal, Napoleon attempts suicide, and when he believes death imminent, sends a last message to Josephine by Caulaincourt, "You will tell Josephine that my thoughts were of her before life departed." It was on Monday, May 23rd, that Josephine's illness commenced, after receiving at dinner the King of Prussia and his sons, one afterwards Wilhelm der Gries, first Emperor of Germany. Whether the sore throat which killed her was a quinsy or diphtheria is difficult to prove, but the latter seems the more probable. Corvisart, who was himself ill and unable to attend, told Napoleon that she died of grief and worry. Before leaving for the Waterloo campaign, Napoleon visited Malmaison, and there, as Lord Rosebery reminds us, allowed his only oblique reproach to Marie-Louise to escape him. Poor Josephine. Her death, of which the news took me by surprise at Elba, was one of the most acute griefs of that fatal year, 1814. She had her failings, of course, but she, at any rate, would never have abandoned me. Series P. Number 1. Written from Königsberg, M. Masson in Josephine Repudiae, says Danzig, but on June 11th Napoleon writes to Eugene, "I shall be at Königsberg tomorrow," where his correspondence is dated from henceforward. A day or two later, he writes the King of Rome's governess that he trusts to hear soon that the 15-months-old child has cut his first 4 teeth. Number 2. Gumbinnen, June 20th from this place, and on this date goes forth the first bulletin of the Grande Armée. It gives a résumé of the causes of the war, dating from the end of 1810, when English influence again gained ascendancy. On July 29th, he writes Hortense from Weipzig to congratulate her on her eldest son's recovery from an illness. A week later, he writes his librarian for some amusing novels, new ones for choice, or old ones that he has not read, or good memoirs. Josephine, meanwhile, has permission to go to Italy. Owing to her grandson's illness, she defers starting till July 16th. Through frightful weather, she reaches Milan via Geneva on July 28th and has a splendid reception. On the 29th, she writes to Hortense, I have found the 3 letters from Eugene, the last one dated the 13th. His health is excellent. He still pursues the Russians without being able to overtake them. It is generally hoped the campaign may be a short one. May that hope be realized. 2 days later, she announces the birth of Eugene's daughter Amelia, afterwards Empress of Brazil. Towards the end of August, Josephine goes to Aix and meets the Queen of Spain with her sister Désirée Bernadotte, the former kind and amiable as usual, the latter, very gracious to me, rather a new experience. From Aix she goes to Prégny-la-Tour, on the Lake of Geneva, and shocks the good people in various ways, says M. Masson, especially by innuendos against Napoleon, and he adds, if one traces back to their source the worst calumnies against the morals of the emperor, it is Josephine that one encounters there. She gets to Malmaison October 24th. Soon after his return from Moscow, Napoleon pays her a visit, and about this time she begins to see the King of Rome, whose mother has always thought more of her daily music and drawing lessons than of whether she was making her son happy or not. 1812 closed in gloom, but 1813 was in itself terribly ominous to so superstitious a woman as Josephine. 13 is always unlucky, and moreover the numbers of 1813 add up to 13. Also the doom-dealing year began on a Friday. Everyone felt the hour approaching. As Napoleon said at St. Helena, the star grew pale, I felt the reins slipping from my hand, and I could do no more. A thunderbolt could alone have saved us, and every day, by some new fatality or other, our chances diminished. Sinister designs began to creep in among us. Fatigue and discouragement had won over the majority. My lieutenants became lax, clumsy, careless, and consequently unfortunate. They were no longer the men of the commencement of the revolution, nor even of the time of my good fortune. The chief generals were sick of the war. I had gorged them too much with my high esteem, with too many honors and too much wealth. They had drunk from the cup of pleasure and wished to enjoy peace at any price. The sacred fire was quenched. Up to August fortune had smiled again upon her favorite. With conscripts for infantry and without cavalry, he had won Lutzen, Botzen, and Dresden, and even so late as September Byron was writing that, bar epilepsy and the elements, he would back Napoleon against the field. But treachery and incompetence had undermined the empire, and Leipzig, that battle of giants, where 110,000 soldiers were killed and wounded, made final success hopeless. In 1814, his brothers Lucien and Louis rallied to him, and Hortense was for the only time proud of her husband. She thinks if he had shown less suspicion and she less pride, they might have been happy after all. My husband is a good Frenchman. He is an honest man. Meanwhile, Talleyrand is watching to guide the coup de grace. Napoleon makes a dash for Lorraine to gather his garrisons and cut off the enemy's supplies. The Allies hesitate and are about to follow him, as per the rules of war. Talleyrand, the only man who could ever divine Napoleon, sends them the message, "You can do everything and you dare nothing, dare therefore once." Hortense is the only man left in Paris, and in vain she tries to keep Marie-Louise, whose presence would have stimulated the Parisians to hold the Allies at bay. It is in vain. Unlike Prussia or Austria, who fought for months, or Spain, who fought for years, after their capitals were taken. Like Nineveh, Carthage, Babylon, and Rome, France yields to the conqueror, vanquished at home. After Marmont's betrayal, Napoleon attempts suicide, and when he believes death imminent, sends a last message to Josephine by Caulaincourt, "You will tell Josephine that my thoughts were of her before life departed." It was on Monday, May 23rd, that Josephine's illness commenced, after receiving at dinner the King of Prussia and his sons, one afterwards Wilhelm der Gries, first Emperor of Germany. Whether the sore throat which killed her was a quinsy or diphtheria is difficult to prove, but the latter seems the more probable. Corvisart, who was himself ill and unable to attend, told Napoleon that she died of grief and worry. Before leaving for the Waterloo campaign, Napoleon visited Malmaison, and there, as Lord Rosebery reminds us, allowed his only oblique reproach to Marie-Louise to escape him. Poor Josephine. Her death, of which the news took me by surprise at Elba, was one of the most acute griefs of that fatal year, 1814. She had her failings, of course, but she, at any rate, would never have abandoned me. Appendix 1. A reputed poem by Napoleon I. Le Chien le Lapin et le Chasseur. Fable composée à l'âge de 13, ans par Napoleon I. César, Chin de rert renommé, mais trop inflé de son mérite tenait rerte, dans son guide en malheureux lapin de pour in ennemi. Renstoy. Lui cria-t-il, d'une voix de tonnerre qui fit au loin trembler les pupilles des boys. Gisouais César, cano par ses exploits, et dont le nom remplit tout la terre. Et si grand nom, Ginot lapin, recommandant de son aime pénitent, demande d'une voix tremblante. Tres serenas I matin si Jimmy Rennes quel ciramon destin. Tu murras. G murray, dit la baird innocent, et si G fuis, ton trapas est certain. Quoi, reprit el animal qui si nurit de thym, des ducates G dois perder la vie. Equevater august saneri vuel me pardoner, puisquil me faut mourir si Jos tenter de amenfur. Il dit et fuit en heros de Garen, caten elorate bleme, G disquil en ut patort. Car le chasseur le voit à peine quil el agist, le tirette le chintam mort que durate de cessi notter bon la fontaine aid toi, le ciel tiadera. Approve fort set méthode la. Appendix 2. Genealogy of the Bonaparte family. Many more or less fictitious genealogies of the Bonapartes have been published, some going back to mythical times. The first reliable record, however, seems to be that of a certain Bonaparte of Sarzana in northern Italy, an imperial notary, who was living towards the end of the 13th century, and from whom both the Corsican and the Trevisan or Florentine Bonapartes claim their origin. From him in direct line was descended François de Sarzana, who was sent to Corsica in 1509 to fight for the Republic of Genoa. His son Gabriel, having sold his patrimony in Italy, settled in Ajaccio, where he bore the honorable title of Messer, and where, being left a widower, he assumed the tonsure and died canon of the cathedral. From him an unbroken line of Bonapartes, all of whom in turn were elected to the dignity of Elder of Ajaccio, brings us to Charles Bonaparte Napoleon, father of the emperor. Appendix 3. Reputed letters of Napoleon to Josephine, taken from the memoirs of Madame d'Acrest. The author asked the advice of Monsieur Frédéric Masson about these letters, to which he at once received the courteous reply, Il faut absolument rejeter les lettres publiées par Rigaud Varin et reproduites par Georgette d'Acrest, pas une en est authentique. No one who has read much of Napoleon's correspondence can in fact believe for a moment in their authenticity. They are interesting, however, as showing the sort of stuff which went to form our grandfather's fallacies about the relations of Napoleon and Josephine. Madame d'Acrest occasionally played and sang for Josephine after the divorce. Her father was a nephew of Madame de Genlis. Madame d'Acrest married a musical composer, M. Bachsa, the then celebrated author of Dansemony and Noces de Gamache. He afterwards deserted her, and her voice having completely failed, she was compelled to write her memoirs to earn sustenance thereby. Of these memoirs, M. Masson has said that in the midst of apocryphal documents, uncontroverted anecdotes, impossible situations, are yet to be found some first-hand personal observations. Number 11796. From General Bonaparte to his wife. My first laurel, my love, must be for my country, my second shall be for you. While beating Alvinzi, I thought of France. When I had defeated him, I thought of you. Your son will present to you a standard which he received from Colonel Morbach, whom he made prisoner with his own hands. Our Eugene, you see, is worthy of his father, and I trust you do not think me an unworthy successor of the great and unfortunate general, under whom one should have been proud to learn to conquer. I embrace you. Bonaparte. No, 1804. To General Bonaparte. I have read over your letter, my dear, perhaps for the 10th time, and I must confess that the astonishment it caused me has given way only to feelings of regret and alarm. You wish to raise up the throne of France, and that, not for the purpose of seating upon it those whom the Revolution overthrew, but to place yourself upon it. You say, how enterprising, how grand, and above all, useful is this design. But I should say, how many obstacles oppose its execution, what sacrifices will its accomplishment demand, and when realized, how incalculable will be its results. But let us suppose that your object were already attained, would you stop at the foundation of the new empire? That new creation, being opposed by neighboring states, would stir up war with them and perhaps entail their ruin. Their neighbors, in their turn, will not behold it without alarm or without endeavoring to gratify their revenge by checking it. And at home, how much envy and dissatisfaction will arise, how many plots must be put down, how many conspiracies punished. Kings will despise you as an upstart, subjects will hate you as an usurper, and your equals will denounce you as a tyrant. None will understand the necessity of your elevation. All will attribute it to ambition or pride. You will not want for slaves to crouch beneath your authority until, seconded by some more formidable power, they rise up to oppose you. Happy will it be if poison or the poniard. But how can a wife, a friend dwell on these dreadful anticipations? This brings my thoughts back to myself, about whom I should care but little were my personal interests alone concerned. But will not the throne inspire you with the wish to contract new alliances? Will you not seek to support your power by new family connections? Alas, whatever those connections may be, will they compensate for those which were first knit by corresponding fitness, and which affection promised to perpetuate? My thoughts linger on the picture which Firme I say love traces in the future. Your ambitious project has excited my alarm. Console me by the assurance of your moderation. No, 3 December 1809. To the Emperor. My forebodings are realized. You have just pronounced the word which separates us forever. The rest is nothing more than mere formality. Such, then, is the result. I shall not say of so many sacrifices, they were light to me, since they had you for their object, but of an unbounded friendship on my part, and of the most solemn oaths on yours. It would be a consolation for me if the state which you allege as your motive were to repay my sacrifice by justifying your conduct. But that public consideration which you urge as the ground for deserting me is a mere pretense on your part. Your mistaken ambition has ever been, and will continue to be, the guide of all your actions, a guide which has led you to conquests and to the assumption of a crown, and is now driving you on to disasters and to the brink of a precipice. You speak of the necessity of contracting an alliance, of giving an heir to your empire, of founding a dynasty. But with whom are you about to form an alliance? With the natural enemy of France, that artful house of Austria, whose detestation of our country has its rise in its innate feelings, in its system, in the laws of necessity. Do you believe that this hatred, of which she has given us such abundant proof, more particularly for the last 50 years, has not been transferred by her from the Kingdom of France to the French Empire? That the children of Maria Theresa, that skillful sovereign, who purchased from Madame de Pompadour the fatal treaty of 1756, which you never mention without shuddering? Do you imagine, I repeat, that her posterity, when inheriting her power, has not also inherited her spirit? I am merely repeating what you have so often said to me, but at that time your ambition was satisfied with humbling a power which you now find it convenient to restore to its former rank. Believe me, as long as you shall exercise a sway over Europe, that power will be submissive to you, but beware of reverses of fortune. As to the necessity of an heir, I must speak out, at the risk of appearing in the character of a mother prejudiced in favor of her son. Ought I, in fact, to be silent when I consider the interests of one who is my only delight, and upon whom alone you had built all your hopes? That adoption of the 12th of January 1806 was then another political falsehood. Nevertheless, the talents, the virtues of my Eugene are no illusion. How often have you not spoken in his praise? I may say more. You thought it right to reward him by the gift of a throne, and have repeatedly said that he was deserving of greater favors. Well, then, France has frequently re-echoed these praises, but you are now indifferent to the wishes of France. I say nothing to you at present of the person who is destined to succeed me, and you do not expect that I should make any allusion to this subject. You might suspect the feelings which dictated my language. Nevertheless, you can never doubt of the sincerity of my wishes for your happiness. May it at least afford me some consolation for my sufferings. Great indeed will be that happiness if it should ever bear any proportion to them. Number 4. Part of a letter said to be dated Brienne, 1814. On revisiting this spot, where I passed my youthful days, and contrasting the peaceful condition I then enjoyed with the state of terror and agitation to which my mind is now a prey, often have I addressed myself in these words. I have sought death in numberless engagements. I can no longer dread its approach. I should now hail it as a boon. Nevertheless, I could still wish to see Josephine once more. Number 5. To the Empress Josephine, at Malmaison. Fontainebleau, 16th April 1814. My dear Josephine, I wrote to you on the 8th instant. It was on a Friday. You have perhaps not received my letter. fighting was still going on. It is possible that it may have been stopped on its way. The communications must now be re-established. My determination is taken. I have no doubt of this note coming to your hands. I do not repeat what I have already told you. I then complained of my situation. I now rejoice at it. My mind and attention are relieved from an enormous weight. My downfall is great, but it is at least said to be productive of good. In my retreat, I intend to substitute the pen for the sword. The history of my reign will gratify the cravings of curiosity. Hitherto, I have only been seen in profile. I will now show myself in full to the world. What facts have I not to disclose? How many men are incorrectly estimated? I have heaped favors upon a countless number of wretches. What have they latterly done for me? They have all betrayed me, one and all, save and except the excellent Eugene, so worthy of you and of me. May he ever enjoy happiness under a sovereign fully competent to appreciate the feelings of nature and of honor. Adieu, my dear Josephine, follow my example and be resigned. Never dismiss from your recollection one who has never forgotten and never will forget you. Farewell, Josephine. Napoleon. P.S. I expect to hear from you when I shall have reached the island of Elba. I am far from being in good health. Footnotes. Memoirs et correspondence de l'impératrice Joséphine, par J. B. J. Innocert Philadelphe Rignalt Varin. Paris, 1820, 80. This book is not in the British Museum catalogue. Josephine Impératrice et Réunie, Paris, 1899.